Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Azure Cleveland User Group. A little bit about the group. We meet every second Wednesday. The meetings are free of charge and open to the public, and we cover a variety of topics related to Azure. Infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. You can find meeting information posted at Azure Cleveland Meetup with the link listed at the bottom of the slide. Some general overhead information. First and foremost, please keep in mind participation is encouraged. And like I always say, the only stupid question is the one not being asked. So feel free to jump in at any point in time with a question or a comment. We want to keep it casual but organized, meaning we want to give our speaker enough time to go through the slides and the demos, but at the same time casual enough where you can interrupt every so often with a question. Also, the presentation will be recorded and posted on YouTube with the link available in chat in just a little bit. So for tonight's presentation, we have Joseph D'Antoni, and he's going to be presenting on understanding Azure Active Directory for data professionals. Joseph is a principal consultant at Denny and Associates Consulting, and he has 20 plus years of experience. He's also a Microsoft MVP in the data platform. And if that's not enough, he's also a speaker, author, and blogger. And he joins us from Malvern, PA. And so with that, let me turn it over to Joe.
All right, everyone, welcome. This is Understanding Azure Active Directory for Data Professionals. Like Sam said, this is going to be a really interactive session. Ask me anything you want. I have a lot of demos because we have a kind of a fully productionized Azure Active Directory environment that we use at DCAC that I can kind of share, so we can dive into some details and answer some questions. So, like Sam mentioned, I'm principal consultant at Denny and Associates Consulting. I do a lot of work with SQL Server. I do a lot of work with various Azure platforms. I've got a ton of Azure certifications because of various partner requirements. So I've done a lot of work kind of in the Azure Active Directory space as well as the Azure Data Platform space. Working with a pretty wide variety of customers and helping them to build solutions. One of the things that's challenging about a cloud world as we evolve into not just adopting, cloud for our infrastructure and data services, but cloud for our platform as a service offerings is identity management. And we have all these we have, many identities. As a consultant, I get to experience this all the time. I probably have 10 or 12 different Azure Active Directory accounts. And some of those, like my DCAC identity, have multiple tenants associated with them. So I have to think about all that. And beyond that, we have all these software as a service applications. So whether it's Dropbox, Workday, ServiceNow, Salesforce, Dropbox, Office 365, any of those. We also have our on-premises applications, which we still have to authenticate to. We have partners and customers we have to work with, and that's another thing that was always a challenge. I don't know if anybody has ever worked with Active Directory in the past, has experienced that kind of having to do trust between organizations. That was never really a good experience, and it was never designed to kind of operate at any sort of scale where you could just add employees. If we did trust so we could authenticate with our current credentials, we'd have to have, like 45 trust in our organization based on the number of clients we have. Also managing employees and managing devices too. This is something that has really changed over time. As we still do have some people that are back in the office now, but a lot of people work remotely. And even before we had a lot of people working remotely, we always had salespeople and field personnel, and having to manage security and identity on those devices was always something that was part of the challenge of managing remote employees. If they didn't pop into VPN every so often, they'd lose their Kerberos ticket. And then they wouldn't be able to authenticate. So having all of these problems, Azure Active Directory can help us have a single solution as an identity provider to provide that solution for us. So what we're going to cover in this talk is what is Azure AD? The general architecture of Azure Active Directory, it's quite different fundamentally from how traditional Active Directory works. We will talk about the integration with on-premises Active Directory. We'll talk about how we make this work, and we'll talk about the graph infrastructure that Azure kind of uses. We'll also kind of show a bunch of different demos from some of the feature sets that are available. We'll show authenticating from SQL Server, which is a kind of a new feature in 2022, but we'll also talk about it from an Azure SQL database and managed instance perspective and how that all works. So Azure Active Directory lets you have kind of modernized access. It's a cloud-based identity and access management service, which helps you and your employees sign in and access resources like Office 365, Azure Portal, and thousands of other software as a service applications. So one of the reasons why Azure Active Directory is so important is if you're using Azure at all, you use Azure Active Directory identities to provide security for your Azure platform. So anything you do within Azure is a privilege from Azure Active Directory. So you have to have Azure Active Directory. Likewise, if you're using Office 365, you have to have Azure Active Directory. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but back before Azure was as broadly adopted, but Office 365 was more broadly adopted, a lot of organizations had Azure Active Directory and they didn't even realize they had it because they were just using it for Office 365. This also lets us secure and govern, and this is one of the real advantages to Azure AD over AD. With Active Directory, it was possible to integrate third-party solutions for things like multi-factor authentication, but Azure Active Directory gives us a much broader set of tools that we have. We have strong authentication methods. For example, one of the things I'm going to demo tonight is using a YubiKey to authenticate into Azure Active Directory. The same thing we can do in Windows 11 to authenticate to Windows Hello. We have conditional access policies. Like, for example, at DCAC, since we all work from home, all of our houses are exempted from having to pass in multi-factor authentication. However, the Azure portal and the Azure Partner Center do still require us to MFA. So that's one of the kind of interesting things. We also have strong identity protections. There's risk-based authentication, even if you don't have multi-factor turned on. And if you learn nothing else from this presentation, you should turn on multi-factor authentication. But strong identity protection. We also have privileged identity management, which is kind of a just-in-time permissions configuration. Just to give you an example, I am global administrator of our AAD, which is effectively like domain admin in a regular Windows world. But I don't have that role all the time. I have to activate that role. And I could make it so that if I had to activate that role, my manager would approve me for that. In this case, I just simply activate the role. And we also have governance over those identities. So we have auditing and tracking, and we have things like access reviews that let us take advantage of that. We can connect and collaborate with customers and partners. So it's very easy to add customer and partner identities to our Azure Active Directory. In fact, I think in some ways it's a little bit too easy. Because if you're using SharePoint in Office 365 and you add an external person, their identity gets created in your Azure Active Directory. That's not that much of a risk because they don't have any permissions within your Azure Active Directory other than their SharePoint ones. It just can be a little disconcerting when you're looking at your entire list of users. Beyond just customers, we also have, there's also a concept known as Azure Business to Consumer, which doesn't really exist in the database space. But if you're building an application and you want to rely on Facebook, Google, or any of some of the other social authentication methods, you can do that, and you can add those customers into. It ends up being a separate Azure Active Directory tenant, but you can add those customers in there. And then development. So it's very easy to add this single sign-on if you're an application developer to your app. We have couple lines of code importing the right libraries, and you can go ahead and do that. So it's a very easy platform to work with as a software developer, and that's something else that's really nice to have. So the reason why I started doing this talk, especially to data audiences, uh, is people got really confused when this started showing up in SQL Server Management Studio. You see all those Active Directories there, uh, and along with Windows authentication. So in SQL Server parlance, Windows authentication is Kerberos, so the old school Azure or the old school Windows AD. SQL Server auth is simply local auth within the database instance. And universal auth is what you're supposed to be using because that allows for multi-factor authentication. Password authentication is simply just passing in a password, and then integrated authentication is for a configuration that used to be more common but has fallen out of favor, which is where you have Azure Directory Federation Services, Azure Directory, Active Directory Federation Services configured with your environment, and you get authenticated by an Active Directory Federation service. So in that scenario, your passwords aren't actually, the hashes of your passwords aren't stored in the cloud, which is, I think, in the earlier days when people trusted the cloud less, that was a kind of a big concern. But more organizations now are storing their passwords in the cloud. And just a reminder, this is like the common slide that we share across all these solutions with the vendors responsible for and what you're responsible for. Across all of these services, the customer is responsible for authentication and authorization. You have to tell your cloud provider who's authorized to use your application. And while they may provide the authentication platform, they may not. And that's one of the benefits of Azure. So just to show you, let me pop over to the portal here. And this is our environment. If I go into enterprise applications, I think, or no, excuse me, it's app registrations is where I wanted to go. I was right the first time, sorry about that. So if I choose new application here, I get to browse this gallery, which kind of the ironic thing I find about this is the thing they have at the top of this is the four cloud platforms. So AWS, Google Cloud, Oracle, and I guess SAP has a cloud platform. But you can authenticate to all of these things. And in some cases, I would recommend authenticating to all of these things with AAD as your sign-in. But beyond that, you can see some of these featured applications that are listed, and these are all pretty popular as software as a service applications. Here you can choose to create your own application, so you can do your library there. But you have a number of ways to do that. And I'm actually connected to our VPN right now, so this won't work, but well, I'll show it to you later anyway. But these are just some of the featured applications. So here, if I want to choose on-prem applications, I can set them up using app proxy, which we'll talk about, or I can find other applications. So if I search, for example, ServiceNow, I see ServiceNow's there. I see SolarWinds Service Desk. Pretty much any major application that you're using is gonna work with single sign-on and AAD. So the one gotcha there, and this isn't Microsoft's fault, a lot of those vendors will upcharge your license tier if you want to have single sign-on, which really kind of sucks because you shouldn't have to pay for security, but you do. So who uses Azure Active Directory? So IT admins who control access to Azure resources and applications. Like I mentioned, any control plane activity is governed by the roles and responsibilities in Azure Active Directory. There's three main roles: reader, contributor, and owner. There are a lot more custom roles for specific types of resources. And those roles cascade down from the subscription level to the resource group down to the individual resource. So you have very granular ways of how you can control access to Azure. Application developers who can build single sign-on into their applications for both logins and identities. And if you're using O365 as a subscriber, that's how you're authenticating. This is actually one of the reasons why it's kind of a big deal is you can force modern authentication methods onto Outlook and Exchange. because you're having to use AAD. Currently, that's not supported for on-prem Exchange. So when we look at the way tenants and things are constructed, each Azure subscription belongs to a tenant. A tenant can have multiple subscriptions. A tenant is effectively kind of like a Windows domain in that you can have it's one realm of authentication, but one account can belong to multiple tenants, but it's always home to a single tenant. And what do I mean by that? So if me as Joey at dcac.com, if I was guested into the Contoso domain through a business to business connection, if my account was terminated for Joey at dcac.com, I would no longer be able to authenticate against DCAC. Therefore, I would no longer have access into Contoso, even though my account would still be there. I wouldn't be able to authenticate to get to that privilege. But all subscriptions belong to a tenant. Commonly, it's very common for organizations to have many subscriptions, especially large organizations. Even smaller organizations will have like dev test and production commonly. But I've seen like Microsoft has thousands of subscriptions, and some other companies I've worked with have similar subscriptions. One thing that used to be a thing in the past, but is less so now, is when companies got an Office 365 subscription, before they got an Azure subscription, they would have the shadow tenant, which still exists, but they would end up with two different tenants, so they couldn't federate their on-prem Active Directory properly. This hasn't really been too much of an issue in a long time, but it is something that I still run into every now and then, so just keep that in mind.
If you're a mid-sized organization, would you typically just have one tenant?
Yeah, I mean, the only reason why you would have more than one tenant, and I can give you a quick example. I have a customer that even large size organization, like Microsoft only has one tenant, but I have a customer that's got kind of they're a company that sells data, and we built a product where they sell data access directly to customers, and we have that in its own Azure subscription. But we also have it in its own tenant it's got a subdomain of their domain name. So like if they were contoso.com in their primary, we have customer.contoso.com in that other tenant. And the reason why we did that was just so we could like guest users into that tenant without stepping on, because we knew we were going to have a lot of guest users because of the nature of that business model. And we didn't want to have like those guest users all intermingled with their regular business stuff, right? In all the same tenant. So we did that way. But having a single tenant is definitely the most common. I mean, a tenant is very much analogous to a regular Active Directory domain. And I know some companies have a couple of different domains, but it's even less common in Azure, just because it tends to work better as a flat solution.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So Azure Active Directory, one of the complaints I have about Azure Active Directory, and I don't have too many, but is that I wish it wasn't called Active Directory, because it conjures, all the things we've been working with for the last 20 years plus years with Active Directory. They should have called it Cloud Auth or something. But it does bring Microsoft some credibility and immediate understanding, especially to enterprise customers, that identity management is going to be a lot easier in the cloud. So we have things like directory services like we had in the past with AD, but it's using modern protocols instead of LDAP. In Kerberos, we're using SAML and OAuth and those sorts of things. So it's a lot more flexible for modern applications. There's a lot better identity governance around it. We have better application access management, and the standards around this are a lot easier to deal with. So our terminology here, an identity is simply a thing that can get authenticated. This can be a user, a managed identity, or what we're moving to now is more service principal identities. And those are assigned to various Azure resources. Like you can assign that to a VM, you can assign that to an automation account, and those service principals get specific Azure permissions and then can do things. An account is just simply an identity that has data associated with it. Azure AD accounts are also known as work or school accounts when you're logging into various Microsoft stuff. And this gets kind of confusing in my opinion. That's just simply an account that's associated with an organizational tenant. In Azure AD, we have a role called Global Administrator. As I mentioned earlier, this is the Azure equivalent of what a domain administrator is in Active Directory. There are some other roles. One thing you should note, let me just pop back here to show a quick demo. If I go to my subscriptions, and I'll just pop, we have like 6 subscriptions, but I'll pop into one of our subscriptions, production. The way my security is handled is I have all these role assignments, and these are my specific Azure roles. So this is like things I can do on the control plane of Azure, which in this case, you can see I'm owner, which means I can do just about anything and assign permissions to anything. Being subscription owner, however, does not mean I can do anything in Active Directory. So Active Directory has its own set of, and I went to the wrong space. This menu is a little not easy to remember. I wanted roles and administrators. I have this separate set of roles that's populating here that are all specific to Azure Active Directory things. And a lot of these are Office 365 related, which is why we have so many. I don't even know what Microsoft Kazala is. But here we see like Intune Administrator, and then the big one here is Global Administrator, and then Global Reader, which can read anything. So we have these roles are separate, and they are specific to Azure Active Directory. Finally, Microsoft accounts. This is where I get confused with work or school accounts sometimes, because we have these are just simply personal accounts that are formally known as live IDs, but they can be used for just about anything now. So one of the ways we sync our identities is to use something called Azure Active Directory Sync. This connects our on-prem environment to our cloud environment. ADFS is optional here. As I mentioned before, it's something that's less commonly used, and we can see that in our domain. So here, if I go to monitoring, yeah, that's sign-ins. Where was my federation? It used to be on the front page. Oh, there we go. Azure AD Connect enabled. So I can see my last sync was an hour ago. There's not much that you can see here from the portal, by the way. To get any of this, you have to connect typically to your whatever VM you have doing the sync. It's not recommended, although we had it for years. It's not recommended that you use a domain controller to run the sync executable. It should be a separate VM. We don't have ours in Azure. It's actually in our colo. And the main reason for that is it's a VM that runs all the time, and we don't feel like paying for it, and we don't have to. But Azure AD Cloud Sync is just an executable file that talks both to Azure Active Directory and regular Active Directory. And here, if we navigate in to users, and I find myself, because I have a lot of users in our domain, so here I can see my main account is joeatcac.com. I can see that it's an on-premise sync enabled, so this account came from on-premises. I can see that it's my identity from DCA Associates on Microsoft.com, which is our Microsoft domain. So that's one thing to note. You always have like a Microsoft domain when you create your account, but you can add a regular account to it. And since that is from on-prem, it's sync enabled. The sync process is not really a big deal. It typically runs once, and it's something you do, and then you're done. One of the things that's challenging about Azure Active Directory is that it is a globally replicated service, and there are free, basic, and premium tiers. However, if Azure Active Directory goes down, it's a bad day for everybody. And this has happened, I think, twice since Azure has existed. and I know the team did a lot of work to try to make the service a little bit more robust in how they handle change and things like that. So fortunately, it hasn't gone down in a while. There is some replication. You don't really do anything to configure the replication. You don't have any control over that. It kind of like is what it is as to how they route writes and things like that. The one thing you do have some control over is there are tiers. So you can see here where Azure AD Premium P2. If you're an enterprise, I would recommend using P1. There's a lot of features like conditional access that are really need to have, and the way things get logged and things like that are a lot better in the Premium 1 tier. Also, you get MFA as part of that. You kind of get MFA as part of the free tiers, but not so much. Not so much.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
What's the time for credentials to replicate from one AD to another, roughly speaking?
So it's a synchronous process. So if I add you to our AD, you can log in as soon as it's done. It's not like AD where you had replication between domain controllers. I suspect, I don't know this, the replication for high availability and disaster recovery probably happens at the storage tier in Azure. Like they're probably leveraging geo-replicated storage for that. If I had, and I'm completely speculating here. They obviously for identity services, they tend to be kind of quiet about what the actual architecture is, but just knowing how a lot of things get built in Azure, that would probably be my guess. So like the initial configuration in the whatever region where it's writable is going to be synchronous, but it's really not like a domain controller where, if you were connected to the wrong DC, it might be 10 minutes before your password change was reflected or something like that. That's not something you really experience.
Okay, thanks.
So we have single sign-on, and one of my favorite parts of that is being able to access on-premises apps without using a VPN. So I'm connected to our VPN, but I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect right now because I don't need to be connected, and I'm gonna navigate to our vCenter. We have put. So this is what I was just showing was Azure App Proxy. We have VMware vCenter presented. And you'll notice it forced me to log in to vCenter. And I just wanted to show you one or two other kind of interesting login things that relate to Azure Active Directory and the security we have there. The first is I'm going to sign in just kind of normally here. And this is going to force me to multi-factor authenticate. And you'll notice that sign-in request is giving me a number. And this is something that I highly recommend enabling. This is number matching. And so on my Authenticator app, I have to type in that number before it will authenticate me. There are a number of recent attacks where threat actors have been slamming carefully selected accounts that they have credentials for with multi-factor authentication prompts in the hopes that they will just authenticate against one. That's problematic, obviously. So we don't want that because that's a bad thing. I'm also going to sign out again here, and I'll do the same. I'm going to do the slightly different login because it's something I like to advocate for is using passwordless authentication. So here I'm going to say sign in with Windows Hello or security key. And I have a USB security key that you can't see that's plugged into my laptop. It's a YubiKey. And so now if I touch my key, it's going to prompt me for my PIN. And I'll hit OK. And then I'll touch my PIN again. And you'll notice I didn't have to go through the same process there of multi-factor authentication. And if we drill in, I'll make this big. If we drill into the sign-in logs, I'll be able to show you what Azure kind of the way it did that. And these are asynchronous, unfortunately, so it's not going to show up right away. So this, let's see. Yeah, that was single factor, and I should have one from Pennsylvania in a second. VPNs are fun. Anyway, because I used a secure method, which is a YubiKey authentication, I didn't have to worry about multi-factor authenticating. So that's something else that has like recently been added to conditional access, that you can factor in authentication strength as to what you have. So lots of cool options there. Plenty of cool stuff that you can do. As I mentioned, there are plenty of pre-integrated software as a service applications that you can use that identity in. And this is a pretty big gap that we see with a lot of customers where they have employees who are just using whatever credentials they like, local credentials for if you're a SQL Server person, it's like the equivalent of using SQL credentials across all of these applications. Now you can use that all with these third-party applications. Like I mentioned, you want to kind of ensure that you understand the pricing model. I remember DocuSign being a big concern there. Like our pricing basically doubled if we wanted to use a single sign-on with DocuSign, so we elected out of it. And likewise, we can connect and sync on-prem like we should. We can even potentially connect with other LDAP directories to load in and web services and things like that. But this gives us a robust authentication mechanism. And we have health for AAD Connect. You will immediately start getting emails if you don't take advantage of that, or you start having problems with that. And we have all of these other software as a service applications that are available. Application proxy, like I showed. So what application proxy can do is take an old school app like vCenter that doesn't support authentication protocols, modern authentication protocols, and at least front it with those modern authentication protocols. And this is the way that works. And I kind of mentioned, or you probably didn't hear me when I mentioned the security errors. So this gives you a URL of, in this case, AppX Contoso msappproxy.net. In my case, it was LA-vCenter. And then we're authenticated via Azure Active Directory, and the app service connects into our own DMZ and then connects us to that application. So users connect to a cloud service that's going to route traffic to applications via connectors. Since vCenter is a web app, it's very easy for that to connect using that connector because it's just over port 443. And these connectors are deployed inside your DMZ next to the applications, and users connect to a cloud service that simply routes them into those applications. This is a really good way if you have old school, like ugly third-party vendor applications that you want to have a single identity to at least log and track. You can do that. So Authenticator, if you're not using Authenticator, you should be. It's a really good multi-factor authentication app. I use Microsoft Authenticator for not just my work stuff, but I also have a lot of personal stuff on it. And one of the things you should look towards doing is getting away from using phone and text message based multi-factor authentication. Those are better than nothing. But they are fairly problematic in that there are a number of people that bad threat actors out there who are willing to hijack SIM cards and recreate SIM cards through all sorts of nefarious methods. these authenticator apps are much, much harder to defeat, especially when you're using something like number matching, like I showed. Even better, go with a passwordless authentication mechanism. And I just want to show you, even from Windows, you can do that straight away. If you're on, Windows 10 or Windows 11, I'll just show you that as I bring up my Windows machine in the wrong window. You can use things like Windows Hello for passwordless authentication. One of the biggest advantages of passwordless authentication is your users don't need to know their passwords inherently. And I know that's kind of a screwball concept, but that way you're not having to rotate passwords and things like that. So it's a little bit easier for users to kind of get started. And I should have had this VM up and running, and I don't, but I'll do that demo in a second. We'll just wait. So I think everybody probably, I hope, knows what multi-factor authentication is. This, for the most part, requires P1 in Azure Active Directory. There are a couple of ways to get around that to force users in, but it is part of Premium. You can prevent unauthorized cloud access to both on-prem and cloud applications by providing an additional level of auth. And this is trusted by thousands of enterprises to authenticate companies, employees, customers, and partner access. And while I'm waiting for that VM to come up, one of the reasons why a lot of DBAs were excited about this Azure Active Directory feature in SQL Server 2022 is we wanted to have the ability to use Azure Active Directory authentication to connect to. Make sure my VPN's alive. Yeah, something's up with my network. I'll kind of skip that as well. But we can use Azure Active Directory authentication to authenticate into on-prem or running in a cloud VM SQL Server, and that's something that we kind of there's an agent that needs to be installed on your VM so it can run into Azure. And this slide's a little bit older, and I should update this. One of the things, if you really kind of want to start to get advanced in your security approach, is disabling phone calls and text messages because they are not secure. And that's maybe something you don't want to do for your end users, just because end users are kind of challenging and always a pain point. But it is something you may want to consider admins or your executive staff. It's a little bit harder with executive staff, but their accounts are some of the most critical, and they're some of the most likely to be attacked by phishing attacks and things like that. So the better job you do at protecting them, the better that is. So, and the main reason why your admins, threat actors are going to be seeking out your admins and your executives. They're not going to be seeking out Bob in accounting. So it's less important, but still kind of important that you get rid of those hackable methods for those people. But Bob and your execs and IT staff, you really want to force onto mobile apps. And that number matching thing I showed you, that's something you also really want to consider. And that's something you can enable at the portal level. And since my other demos are kind of hung up right now, if we go into security here, and I go to authentication methods, here I click on Microsoft Authenticator. If I go to my configuration screen, I can require number matching for push notifications. This is going to be a default starting, I think, in Q1 of 2023. You can also, and I like these two features too, because they don't really cost you anything, but they're nice. And in there, I see at the top of the screen, number matchings 27 February 2023. also recommend showing the application name in push and passwordless notifications, as well as the geographic location. That's something else that's good to know. The other thing here too is if we go to authentication methods again, and I lost the screen I was on, here you see I have FIDO2 security key enabled. So that's what allows us to use YubiKey based authentication for our environments. And that's something that is also something I really like to have because it does allow me to authenticate in that manner. One of the other things that we have is as part of conditional access. Here I have MFA with YubiKeys, and I have this condition, and this is a new thing, where I can effectively say if sign-in risk is high and medium, I can then force this, and I'll get rid of that. I can then require a phishing-resistant MFA, which would be something like a FIDO key. So basically, I can say, and we don't have this fully enabled because we don't have our FIDO key strategy fully rolled out to our team. But it is something where you can say, if you let Azure Active Directory determine that an account, that a login is considered risky, it will then MFA the user, and won't allow them to log in until they're using a resistant method, like a YubiKey or something like that. So that's a very, very recent addition that kind of became public preview at Ignite. So that's another thing that's pretty nice to have. So Azure SQL Database and SQL Managed Instance is kind of the data part of this. This is pretty straightforward. It just kind of Azure AD is the way you authenticate to these things now. They still all have SQL based options. So if you're using very old clients that don't support authenticating with Azure Active Directory, you can still potentially authenticate. From a security perspective, I would recommend that you not use those sorts of solutions because I think they're less robust than some of the other solutions you might have. And there's a lot more security controls around using Azure Active Directory than there is anything else you can use. So one of the things that in a multi-cloud hybrid world that I think really helps us a lot with Azure Active Directory is just having identities all over the place. Because in the old world where we simply had AD and everything was in the same building, it was a lot easier. But now we just have so many identities, and being able to centralize that really helps. One of the things that I really like to talk about here is not domain joining laptops. And it's a little bit controversial, but in the age of ransomware, having loosely connected laptops and user devices is a good thing because, having the risk of one user getting phished and that taking down like all of your backups, all of your database servers, and all of your domain controllers, that's not a good thing. Not something we want to have happen. So separating that out is something that's really important. And just to show you, this is a Windows 11 machine. And I'm going to insert my security key here, and hopefully it will detect it. And the demo gods just aren't on my side tonight. Anyway, I should be able to. There we go. No, it didn't pick it up. I can go in with my pen. but normally I would just use a fingerprint to log in as part of Hello. But this VM isn't directly joined to our domain, so it's loosely joined via AAD, and that allows us to manage it through Intune, and we get some policies. So if I go here to settings, I can see here that I'm connected to dcac.com, but I'm just connected to Azure AD. I'm not actually connected to the dcac.com Active Directory domain. And this gives us the ability to manage the device, but it doesn't fully, it's not like AD where the device is fully connected to the rest of the environment and everything. Single sign-on really helps us have this user identity management where we don't have to worry about disconnected users having access to company resources. So this is something else that's really strong that I really kind of prefer about AAD. We have things like dynamic groups, centralized access administration for SaaS apps, and it's a single console. It hooks into Microsoft's Defender tools in terms of endpoint access management, so we can see who used what. And we also have these conditional accesses, so we can say user app sensitivity, what the state of the device is. So Microsoft, if you're using Defender, Microsoft can use all of this to make better decisions. I found this on the web. Oh, sorry, my watch freaked out. We can also do cloud app discovery, and based on risk, we can block access and have those conditional access rules that are in place. Microsoft has all these models because they're constantly trying to be attacked by various attackers, so they really do have a kind of a good idea of what's going on everywhere. And they use this to build machine learning models to better secure all of Azure and make Azure Active Directory the advanced security authorization and authentication utility that it is. And so you have the ability to kind of protect everything everywhere. And that's really the big benefit we have here. So the other bit of this is that we have a standards-based platform for developers. Custom line of business applications can integrate with AAD. You can hook into Office 365. You can extend the Azure Active Directory schema. Everything works cross-platform. I use a Mac, and I don't have to go into Windows very often. These are all built on open source standards that are widely adopted across industry, which makes it a little bit easier to integrate with other solutions. And then just in summary, security is hard. Don't try to do all this by yourself. Don't try to write your own stuff. Microsoft has done an excellent job building AAD. You should use MFA. Never share your secrets in code. That's something else that not really in the scope of this talk, but there's some advanced security features for GitHub that Microsoft introduced this year. And they do look for secrets in your code, which I thought was a really nice to have. And you'll notice I have use MFA on the slide again. That's not a typo. It is definitely something that you should be using, especially for admin and executive accounts. And it's absolutely worth it to pay for real Azure Active Directory. It does cost per user, but it also comes with some of the plans for Office 365. So if you have Office 365 E3 or E5, you probably have it anyway. And then finally, I'll leave my contact info and I'll take any questions if anybody has anything before we depart. All right, well, I hope everyone enjoyed that and have a good night. Bye.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Just have a couple of wrap-up announcements before we call it a night. With regards to resources, the recording of tonight's presentation will be edited and uploaded to the YouTube channel, and the link has been made available within the chat window. I would kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel to get upload notifications. In addition, Some tech events that we'll cover in just a little bit will be posted on my blog at samnasser.blogspot.com. And again, please subscribe to that to get updates. And last but not least, the feedback eval. If you would please go to the link posted in the chat for forums.office.com, and there will be a link to the evaluation form so we can provide Joe some valuable feedback. Manning.com gives us a 35% off discount at deals.manning.com with a link also available in chat, as you might have guessed. The discount code for that is MTPCLEC21, and there's a variety of books that are available there at discounted rate. With regards to events, seeing as it's the end of the year and we're wrapping up, there really isn't a whole lot to discuss. A lot of the other groups that I usually promote are having in-person holiday parties. Those are located in Michigan and elsewhere. In any case, on December 22nd is the Cleveland C# VB.NET user group. And that topic, we're going to be talking about iDisposables in C#. And January 10th through the 13th is CodeMash. That's going to be happening next year, or early 2023. And the link for that is codemash.org. One of the things that we always like to cover are job openings. So Tech Systems has some job openings posted at techsystems.com/IT-jobs. In addition, I always like to ask who's hiring and who's looking for work. So if you fall into either of those categories, please make yourself known, enter into chat, or jump in verbally. Or you can also email me at a later time, and my contact information, snasser@nistechnologies.com. You can also find me on Twitter at samnasser, and my blog, as I mentioned earlier, samnasser.blogspot.com. And last but not least, if we are not connected on LinkedIn, I invite you to do so, and you can find me under Sam S. Nasser. And so with that, thank you all for joining. Hope you have a great holiday and a great Happy New Year, and look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. Good night, everyone.